And we will do a screen share. All right, and we will take up where we left off in Romans. Okay, the occasion, date, and place of the book of Romans. Let me just enlarge it here. Okay, Paul had been wanting to visit the Roman church for probably a long time. He wanted to preach the gospel and impart some spiritual gift, but he had been prevented from doing it. In Acts 19:21, recording Paul's ministry in Ephesus, it said, after this all happened, Paul decided to go to Jerusalem, passing through Macedonia. Just making a notation here. And Achaia. After I have been there, he said, I must visit Rome also. Paul had a special interest in Rome. So a main component of his of the occasion of this letter is Paul's visit to Rome. Okay, Paul was on his third missionary journey, in which he was gathering a collection for the poor saints in Jerusalem. We know that this was going on at the time of his writing of Romans, because in 15:25 to 26, he says that he is on his way to Jerusalem with the offering which he had already collected from the churches in Macedonia and Achaia. Now, exactly where was Paul when he wrote Romans? Almost certainly it was Corinth. Evidence for Corinth is that Paul commends to them Phoebe, who was a deaconess in the church at Cenchrea. Cenchrea was on the coast 7 miles east of Corinth, so very close there. Gaius, his host, is possibly the Gaius who was from Corinth as well. He's mentioned in 1 Corinthians 1:14. Erastus in 1623 was perhaps the city director of public works in Corinth. He's also mentioned in 2 Timothy 4:20, and there he is in Corinth. And finally, Paul gives greetings from Timothy and Sosipater, who accompanied him on his third missionary journey. These are some of the what scholars say is the date. And you can see pretty much it's AD 55, 56, maybe 57. For the most part is when they date this. Remember that it's Paul's third missionary journey. What is the purpose of Romans? All of Paul's letters were occasional or situational. That is, some specific occasion gave rise to them. So Paul is writing to meet some occasion, some situation. But as you compare Romans with, for example, 1 Corinthians, you'll see that the situation in Rome is much more in the background than that situation in Corinth when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. The content of Romans is much more theological. It is not a systematic treatise, and to some extent, the context is determined by the situation of the readers, but exactly what that situation was is less obvious than in many of Paul's other letters. No doubt Paul wanted to promote his mission to Spain among the people at Rome. He indicates this in 1:10-15. He said, "And I pray that now at last, by God's will, the way may be open for me to come to you. I long to see you so that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. That is, that you and I may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith. I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that I planned many times to come to you, but have been prevented from doing so until now, in order that I might have a harvest among you, just as I have had among the other Gentiles." And in 15:23 and 24, he says, "But now that there is no more place for me to work in these regions, and since I have been longing for many years to see you, I plan to do so when I go to Spain. I hope to visit you while passing through and to have you assist me on my journey there after I have enjoyed your company for a while." So the first purpose of Romans was to prepare the Roman church for Paul's proposed visit and to elicit support for his missionary journey in Spain. Beyond this, it's difficult to pinpoint a precise purpose. Opinions are divided as to what the purpose of Romans is. Opinions range all the way from giving a summary of his teachings to smoothing out the tensions between Jews and Gentiles in the Roman church. Some people say it was a last will and testament that Paul was writing to give a systematic treatise, a treatment of his teachings. Morris sees the vision to Rome and further trip to Spain as the major motivation for writing the epistle, with the theological content telling the Romans what he believed. We know that Paul was aware of the situation in the Roman church, as we can tell when we look at chapters 14-16. Could it be that the church had certain conceptual problems with the teaching of Christianity, and Paul wants to respond to those problems? Probably we will never know exactly what motivated Paul to write this epistle to the Romans. But let us just be thankful that he did, that he left us this treasure, God's word to us. I want us to look briefly at the influence of Romans. Many of the key leaders of the church down through history have been impacted by the book of Romans. Augustine, who was the greatest Christian teacher between Paul and Luther, said, "Suddenly I heard a voice from a nearby house chanting as if it might be a boy or girl." Now here he's describing his conversion. He was not a Christian up to this point, saying and repeating over and over again, "Pick up and read, pick up and read." I interpreted it solely as a divine command to me to open the book and read the first chapter I might find. So I hurried back to the place where I had put down the book of the apostle when I got up. I seized it, opened it, and in silence read the first passage on which my eye lit, which, by the way, can be a very dangerous way to do your Bible study. Not in riots and drunken parties, not in eroticism and indecencies, not in strife and rivalry, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh in its lusts. I neither wished nor needed to read further. At once, with the last words of this sentence, it was as if a light of relief from all anxiety flooded into my heart. All the shadows of doubt were dispelled. Augustine's conversion came when he was reading the book of Romans. Martin Luther was a Roman Catholic priest who was struggling to find out how to be right with God. And this is what he said: I had greatly longed to understand Paul's letter to the Romans, and nothing stood in my way but that one expression, the righteousness of God, because I took it to mean that righteousness whereby God is righteous and acts righteously in punishing the unrighteous. Night and day I pondered until I grasped the truth that the righteousness of God is that righteousness whereby, through grace and sheer mercy, he justifies us by faith. Thereupon I felt myself to be reborn and to have gone through open doors into paradise. The whole of Scripture took on a new meaning, and whereas before the righteousness of God had filled me with hate, now it became to me inexpressibly sweet in greater love. This passage of Paul became to me a gateway into heaven. And so the Protestant Reformation had its beginning. And its beginning came from the book of Romans. John Wesley, on May 24th, 1738, wrote in his journal, I went very unwillingly to a society in Aldersgate Street, London, where one was reading Luther's preface to the Epistle to the Romans. About 9:15, while he was describing the change which God works in the heart through faith in Christ, I felt my heart strangely warmed. I felt I did trust in Christ, Christ alone for my salvation, and an assurance was given me that he had taken my sins away, even mine, and saved me from the law of sin and death. And so we have the 18th century revivals that started here from John Wesley, and it was started by him understanding the message of Romans. In the 20th century, Karl Barth, a young Swiss pastor, discovered the truth of the Epistle to the Romans, and he wrote a commentary, and that commentary was one of the elements that broke the stranglehold that liberalism had on theology. But it's not just the famous people that have been transformed by understanding Romans. Thousands, maybe millions of people have come to God through the message of the Epistle to the Romans. Bruce ends his essay on the influence of Romans with these words: so let those who have read thus far be prepared for the consequences of reading further. You have been warned. Do you see what Bruce is saying? If you don't want your life changed and you're studying the book of Romans, then you better just stop right now, because the chances are very good that you are not going to be the same after you've finished reading Romans. And I just need to make another notation here. Martin Luther says Romans is worthy not only that every Christian should know it word for word by heart, but occupy himself with it every day as the daily bread of the soul. It can never be read or pondered too much, and the more it is dealt with, the more precious it becomes and the better it tastes. Wow. Wow. What all of these are saying about the book of Romans. It is powerful. And Western civilization has been changed because of the book of Romans. F.F. Bruce gives an outline here, and generally, it is, we see chapters 1 to 4 showing the problem of mankind. And then we have chapters 6 to 8 giving the answer to the problem. But chapter 5 in the middle, different people put it different places. Some people put it with chapters 1 to 4, some with 6 to 8. But there Paul outlines the problem of sin, how everybody is under sin. And then in chapter 3, verses 21 to 26, he gives the answer. And the answer is through God setting forth Christ as a propitiation, as a mercy seat for our sins, which we receive through faith. Leon Morris, I know, has said that 3:21 to 26 is the most important paragraph ever written in the history of the world. And then in chapter 11, Paul deals with the issue of the Jews and how they have not responded to the gospel. Now, traditionally, 1:16 to 17, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God unto salvation to all those who believe, unto the Jew first and also to the Greek, and the just shall live by faith. That has been the key verse in Romans, along with 3:21 to 26. For those in the new perspective on Paul, their focus is on chapter 1, verses 3 to 6, and then chapters 9 through 11. And then the second major part of the book is 12 going on basically to the end. And this is the application of the theology that Paul has given in 1 to 11, chapters 1 to 11. And he deals with very many important aspects of the Christian life here, which we don't have time to go into in detail. So we will stop our treatment of Romans here. Do you have any questions or comments on Romans? James D.G. Dunn, in his book on the theology of the Apostle Paul, basically goes with Romans. He takes his content mainly from Romans and supplements it with content from other of Paul's letters. Okay, any questions, comments on the book of Romans? Theologically, the most important of Paul's letters.
Doctor, in Romans 16:22, it is mentioned there that Tertius, who wrote this letter, greet you in the Lord. I just can't quite understand why Tertius claimed that he is writing, and he mentioned this in spite of Paul write the book of Romans, right?
That's right. Paul is the author of Romans. Tertius was the secretary.
Okay.
Okay, so last time we looked at the possible role of Tertius. What exactly was his role as the secretary? Is it word for word? Is it shorthand and then rewriting it, or is Paul saying, "Hey, Tertius, the Romans are having a issue with this. Would you write him something?" You know, I know that wasn't the way it happened, but yeah, he's the secretary. Any other questions or comments? All right, let us go on then.
Sir,
Yes.
is the book of Romans good for new converts or new believers?
I would say so. Yes, if you want to start them out in Paul, that may be a place. It's you know, it's quite heavy, it's quite dense, and so you really have to think your way through it. If you want to start with something light but important, you know, you could start with Philemon, one chapter, and yet we see Paul dealing with important things there. So, but yes, if you wanted to start with Romans, that would be fine. Any other questions, comments?
Yes, doctor. May I ask a question?
Yes, Gustavo.
Well, it's two things. Number one, I have this in mind since last class, but I couldn't ask on time. So, what are the possibilities that the church in Rome was started by people who were present? As you mentioned, that nobody really knows how that started. But what are the possibilities of that church starting after Pentecost with people who were there in Pentecost?
I think it's a very good possibility. Yeah, because there were believers there were Jews from Rome who heard the Christians there speaking in tongues, praising God in their own language. So I would think that is a good possibility. Yeah.
Okay. And my second question is regarding, I am trying to understand what is actually the whole, let's say, theory or proposal, whatever, that the new perspective on Paul is bringing up. So what will be the main differences between the traditional way of understanding Rome's from normal traditional scholars and what is the differences highlight now with the new perspective? It makes sense, the question I'm asking?
Yes.
Okay.
The new perspective puts a strong emphasis on the communal aspects of Christianity. That we are all one, Jew and Gentile. And since that is what Paul deals with in chapters 9 through 11, they see that as the core of what Paul is communicating here in Romans. So they don't reject the individual aspect, but that is not the center of their concern. Their concern is more having to do with the communal aspect. And when we get to Galatians, we will see that that is a major emphasis there by the new perspective on Paul. So they would reject the very individualistic view of being a Christian that many Christians have. But in my opinion, they take it too far. And so your individual relationship with God is sort of a footnote on the really important stuff, which is the communal, that we are all one in Christ. And saying things like, they don't really say this, but I think it's what they mean, that Galatians is not so much about becoming right with God as it is understanding that the Jews and Gentiles are one, and there should not be a separation between the two, which I don't accept. I mean, there shouldn't be a separation. I don't think that's what Paul is getting at there. So, yeah, they would emphasize 9 to 11, where Paul deals with the situation of the Jewish people, and see that as probably the major concern that Paul has here in Romans.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So it doesn't have to do with, or it does, like, with in terms of salvation, or what is more like ecclesiology? I'm trying to understand what is the main emphasis on Paul's perspective, new perspective,
Yeah. Um,
or is
It-
all together?
yeah, it's primarily a matter of emphasis, I would say, when it comes to salvation.
Mhm.
Take justification by faith, for example. For N.T. Wright, he says justification by faith basically has nothing to do with getting saved. What it has to do with is knowing who is saved. So it's not soteriology that it has to do with, it's ecclesiology. It's the church. It's not one's salvation. That justification
Mhm.
by faith has, that's the center of justification by faith. So, traditionally, we believe that when we're justified, that God declares us not guilty before his judgment seat. He says, you are forgiven. You're no longer condemned. Now you are forgiven. You are justified. You're right with God. Okay, that's the traditional way of looking at it. For Wright, it is something that happens after you're saved. And it has to do not with your relationship with God, but so that we can tell who is part of the people of God. It's God's marking people out as his. And that mark is faith, he says, which again, I disagree with, because you can't see faith. You can see a person's life that comes from faith, but faith is inside. It's an attitude. And so anyway, I hope that helps.
Oh, yeah, thank you.
Okay, and maybe by the time we get through the other books, it'll be clearer.
Okay.
All right, let us go on here. Let's see. Here we go. Okay, we're going to the Corinthian letters. I can't spend a lot of time on the background here. I could, but we just don't have time. And so I'm just going to have to go quickly as we go through the background of 1st and 2nd Corinthians. In terms of the city of Corinth, the physical location, Corinth is right there in the center of the Roman Empire. If you look center a little toward the bottom, you'll see Achaia, which is the province, and Corinth right below that. This is a more of a close-up. We have Asia Minor on the right. We have Greece on the left. And this lower part of Greece, it's almost an island. It's only connected by a little neck of land there that connects it to the mainland. That is called the Isthmus of Corinth. And Corinth is right there near that isthmus. And this is important for the city of Corinth. And there's a little closer up view of it. And here it's closer yet. That little neck of land, only about 7 kilometers wide, connects the Saronic Gulf on the right with the Gulf of Corinth on the left. Corinth is right near there and can control all the traffic that goes through there. So if you want to go from the mainland to the Peloponnese, this island, almost island area, you would have to go through Corinth. They could put a tariff on all the traffic through there, which meant that Corinth was bound to become wealthy. But even more important, the east-west traffic, they could put a tariff on, and from that, they got wealthy as well. Just to the east is the port of Cenchrea. In Romans, we said that Phoebe came from Cenchrea, and this is just 7 miles to the east of Corinth. This is looking from the hill behind the city of Corinth up, looking to the Gulf of Corinth. That city that's right on this side of the Gulf there is called New Corinth. There was a city of Lachium up in that area in Paul's time. First century historian Strabo writes, Corinth is called wealthy because of its commerce, since it is situated on the isthmus and is master of 2 harbors, of which one leads straight to Asia and the other to Italy, and it makes easy the exchange of merchandise from both countries. Down here at the bottom of the Peloponnese, we have 2 capes, Cape Malea and Cape Matapan. And the waters off of these was treacherous, was very dangerous. In fact, there was a saying, let him who sails around Malea forget his home, and let him who sails around Malea first make his will. To avoid going down there on that bottom part, if they went up and went over the Isthmus of Corinth, it would save over 300 kilometers around those treacherous waters. And so they would do that. They would, if it was a small boat, they would just take it up out of the water. They had a rail system going across, put it in the other side, and they would go on. If it was a larger ship, they would unload the cargo on one side, take it across, put it into another ship, and then sail on. This was what is left of that rail system that they had called the Diolkos. You can't get to that now because it's on a military base, but this is what is left of it. They have since built a canal through there. Nero started one back in the 60s, but never finished it. It wasn't until the 1880s that they began making this canal, and they finished it in 1893. This is the way looking eastward that the canal looks, and this is from the same spot looking westward. If we go to the city itself, down on the left side, you'll see ancient Corinth. The New Corinth is up above to the right, and Lachion or Lachium directly north. And this is the way it looks on Google Earth, there, ancient Corinth. And it was walled. There was a wall all the way going from Lachium down around Corinth, around the Acrocorinth, the hill that stood behind it, and back up to Lachium. This is the theater. This was what's left of it. This was there at the time of Paul. This is a depiction of what ancient Corinth may have looked like. A very sophisticated place. This is the central area of Corinth. Down in the lower central part, we have the Agora. Agora is normally translated marketplace, but it doesn't mean a place where you go to get vegetables. The Agora is the civic center of the city. Right on the lower part of that, we see the Bema, B-E-M-A. Some people call it Bema. This was the judgment seat. This is where the governor would make rulings. And then there were shops along the side. Businesses, major businesses, government offices were there. Going up toward the top, we had the Lycaon Road, and we'll show you a picture of that in a moment. To the right of that is the Pyrene Fountain. Corinth had one of the most sophisticated underground water systems in the ancient world. And Lycaon Road was lined with shops on both sides. This is the way ancient Corinth today looks. And down at the bottom, we have the Agora, and that's the Lycaon Road going up toward the north. This is the Lycaon Road. And you know, there was the goddess Aphrodite had her temple there. And look, there's Aphrodite right there on the Lycaon Road. No, actually, that's Dicky. So while I was down looking at all the ruins, Dicky came up these stairs that you see at the bottom, and there was a coffee shop there. So she sipped a cappuccino while I went through the ruins, and I was like a child in a candy store. Again, the Lycaon Road. In the back there, we have the Acrocorinth, this famous hill in the back. Here is the Temple of Apollo. This is the major structure that is standing in Corinth today. There are 7 columns there. Originally, it had 38. It was standing there when Paul was in Corinth. And here are some other shots, pictures of the Temple of Apollo. And by the way, I took all of these pictures. I've been to Corinth 3 times. The first time was when I was a student in seminary, and I took out 2.5 months and went to Europe, and one of the places we went was to Corinth. Here is another picture of the temple with the Acrocorinth in the background. And you know, they say that on rare occasion, Apollo himself will appear in his temple. Look, there he is. There he is, right there. You see him? No, actually, that's me. That's me when I was in seminary. You can't tell it, but I have a full beard there, and I think we have somebody coming in here. Anyway, yeah, that is not really Apollo. This was built in 540 BC, and so it was standing when Paul was there, like I said. This is the Acrocorinth. We stayed at a little hotel. Dickie and I were there twice in the last few years, and we were staying at a little hotel right there near the ruins, and this is the view of it from where we were staying. On top of the Acrocorinth, there was a temple to the goddess Aphrodite, the goddess of love. And this is what Strabo, the first century historian, said about it. He said the temple of Aphrodite was so rich that it owned more than 1,000 temple slaves, prostitutes, whom both men and women had dedicated to the goddess. And therefore, it was also on account of these women that the city was crowded with people and grew rich. For instance, the ship captains freely squandered their money, and hence the proverb, not for every man is a voyage to Corinth. So he's saying it was the prostitutes coming down from the temple of Aphrodite on the Acrocorinth that made Corinth rich. This is the head from a statue of Aphrodite. This is the central city of Corinth. This is, that's Lake Chion Road going out to the left. Again, central Corinth. This is the Bema, the judgment seat. In Acts chapter 18, it tells of Paul founding the church in Corinth, and Paul is brought before the governor Gallio. Paul stood right here in front of this Bema, this tribunal it's called, or court. And Gallio, the governor, stood up above there and gave his judgment of Paul. It's fascinating to be able to stand where you know that a biblical character stood. It was right before this Bema. And this is the view looking out from the Bema. This is the Agora there as it looks now. This is a lintel that went over the door of the Jewish synagogue. Now, this probably is from the 2nd century, not when Paul was there, but it shows us that the Jews were there at an early date. If you look at the letters here, if you know Greek letters, you can see it says Sunagoge, Hebr, Hebraion. So synagogue of the Hebrews is what it says. This is the Peirene fountain. It is a sophisticated water system. When I was there, when I was in seminary, you could walk back in there. You can't anymore because it's all roped off. This is the Erastus inscription. Erastus was a character that appears in the Bible. And this inscription says, Erastus, in commemoration of his aedileship, that is curatorship of public buildings, laid this pavement at his own expense. Here we have a biblical character. It's almost certain that they're the same person who put this there in the pavement. He laid this pavement. Originally, it was covered with bronze, and there are still a little bit of bronze on it. And that's just a very brief physical background to Corinth. Now let's look at the history and character, and we will just go quickly here. The history of Corinth.
Sorry, Doctor.
Yes.
Excuse me. Yeah, just a quick question. Is this agora in Corinth the same agora in Ephesus? Was it, or different?
It would be the same function, but Ephesus is a long way away from Corinth. So they're
just same.
Yeah,
Same name, but
agoras.
different location. Yeah.
Right. And it's just the Greek name for,
market.
well, what we would call marketplace, but
Marketplace.
but just remember, it's not like going to the market to buy groceries, you know.
Yeah.
It's the civic center of the city.
Okay, clear.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
The history of Corinth is divided into 2 parts: before the Roman destruction and then after the Roman destruction. So here we're going to look at it briefly before the Roman destruction. And Corinth was characterized by 2 things. The first is prosperity. Because of its location, it was bound to be prosperous. The second is immorality. The city of Corinth was known for its immorality. The word Corinthiadzesthai means to commit fornication. The immorality of Corinth actually changed the Greek language. So to Corinthianize meant to go to prostitutes or to be sexually immoral. Prostitution was the way that was manifested most. The phrase Corinthian girl referred to a prostitute. Here, Strabo tells us about the officials from Rome came, and the people of Corinth threw stuff on them, all kinds of offensive stuff out of their balconies. That didn't go over too well. And the Roman army came against Corinth, and it destroyed Corinth. Not completely, but mostly. The men were killed. The women and children were sold into slavery. And Corinth was subjugated to Rome and lay in ruins, basically in ruins, for 100 years. It was rebuilt by Julius Caesar, and it was called Colonia Laus Julia Corinthiensis, after Julius Caesar. Again, it became prosperous. And Ben Witherington says there are 4 reasons. It had a strategic location, of course. It was a manufacturing center. They manufactured Corinthian bronze. There was like a mania in the Roman Empire for Corinthian bronze. In fact, the emperor had a bureau, a group of people, and their job was just to keep track of his Corinthian bronze. That's how much he had. It was a tourist attraction. They had the Isthmian Games there, second only to the Olympics. Not only did they have the traditional Olympic Games, they also had things like poetry, singing, music, and that kind of thing. And Nero entered the games by singing. He competed in the singing. And this is what Suetonius says. While he was singing, no one was allowed to leave the theater, even for the most urgent reasons. And so it is said some women gave birth to children there, while many who were worn out with the listening and applauding secretly leaped from the wall, since the gates at the entrance were closed, or feigned death and were carried out as if for burial. They were really desperate to get out of there and stop hearing Nero sing. And surprisingly, Nero always won first place. Can you imagine that? And then finally, it was a place where religious pilgrims came. People came there to go to the temples. These are some of the gods that were there. Asclepios was the god of healing, and people would bring images of the parts either that they needed to have healed, or they would bring images of the parts that were healed. And you can see those on display there now. Some of those I can't show because they are of people's private parts. But these are some of the other gods that had temples in Corinth. I'd say there's a 5th reason for Corinth's prosperity, and that's its abundant water supply. Athens had to bring in water in aqueducts for many kilometers, but not so with Corinth. Corinth became known as the most competitive city in the Roman Empire. And Ben Witherington said, Corinth was a city where public boasting and self-promotion had become an art form. The Corinthian people thus lived within an honor-shame cultural orientation where public recognition was more important than facts, and where the worst thing that could happen was for one's reputation to be publicly tarnished. In such a culture, a person's sense of worth is based on recognition by others of one's accomplishments, hence the self-promoting inscriptions. Okay, it's time for a break. Let's take a break here, a 10-minute break, and we will come back in 10 minutes. All right. This monument called the Babius Monument is a monument that somebody made for themselves. Originally, it stood on pillars. It was very tall. And it says, Gnaeus Babius Philinus, Aedile and Pontifex, had this monument erected at his own expense, and he approved it in his official capacity as duover. He made this monument so that people would, remember him. So he would get honor by the people there. And here we are 2,000 years later seeing it. Corinth was the biggest city Paul had yet encountered, a brash new commercial metropolis. It squeezed nearly 250,000 people into a comparatively small area, a large population being slaves engaged in the unending movement of goods. Slaves are free. Corinthians were rootless, cut off from their country of background, drawn from races and districts all over the empire, a curiously close parallel to the population of a 20th century inner city. Paul had seen a Christian church grow and flourish in the moderately sized cities he had founded in Macedonia. If the love of Christ Jesus could take root in Corinth, the most populated, wealthy, commercial-minded, and sex-obsessed city of Eastern Europe, it must prove powerful anywhere. So today we think about our multicultural cities. Well, Corinth was just as multicultural. Okay, let's go on to the introduction when we look at those introductory questions. First of all, authorship. The authorship of 1 Corinthians is unquestioned. I don't know of anyone who doubts that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. If you look, remember those 3 columns that we saw on the authenticity of Paul's letters? This is in the left column. It's in the undisputed letters written by Paul. Robertson and Plummer say, both the external and internal evidence for the Pauline authorship is so strong that those who attempt to show that the apostle was not the writer succeed chiefly in proving their own incompetence as critics. Unity or integrity, the vast majority of scholars see it as being a unity. So unity is not an issue. The occasion. Here we have a section called Paul's dealing with the Corinthians. And what we're going to do is look at the time when Paul first goes to Corinth and founds the church until the last time he is there. And what I'd like to do here is to just use the pen and show where Paul went. Paul was on his second missionary journey when he founded the church. And I'm not going to show the 15 steps here, but I'll just tell them, and I'll just use the map here as we go through. You can follow on your PowerPoint. Number 1, Paul founds the church at Corinth on his second missionary journey. So Paul is coming on his second missionary journey. He comes up to Troas, has the vision there, goes on up to Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, down to Athens, and then on to Corinth. There he spends 18 months with the Corinthians there in this new founded church. He then leaves Corinth. He goes over to Ephesus with Aquila and Priscilla, and then goes back to Jerusalem, and then back up to Antioch. Number 3, he sends a letter to the Corinthian church. This is mentioned in 1 Corinthians 5:9. This is known as the previous letter. So we'll signify that just by making a line here from Ephesus to Corinth. I left out that in Paul's third missionary journey, he comes back to Ephesus. Okay. Number 4, he hears from the members of Chloe's household that the Corinthian church is split into factions. He receives a letter from the Corinthians asking certain questions. It is delivered by Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Achaicus. So they bring a letter to Paul. Number 6, Timothy with Erastus is sent to Corinth via Macedonia. So Paul sends Timothy by land. They go up to Macedonia. And in the meantime, Paul sends a letter to Corinth. And this is 1 Corinthians. So Timothy then goes on down. The letter arrives before Timothy does, because it's going by sea. Timothy is going the slower route by land. And when Timothy arrives in number 6, number 8, Timothy arrives in Corinth on his special mission. Number 9, in the meantime, a serious crisis breaks out in Corinth, in which Paul's authority is challenged. Timothy is at a loss as how to deal with it, and he returns to Paul in Corinth, or in Ephesus. On hearing Timothy, Paul goes briefly to Corinth to deal with it in person. This is his painful visit, mentioned in 2 Corinthians 2:1. He is humiliated before the church and returns to Ephesus in disgrace. So Paul goes to Corinth to try to straighten things out, but he's not successful, and he returns then back to Ephesus. On hearing Timothy, number 11, Paul writes a powerful letter of reproof in order to deal with the crisis and sends it by Titus. This is the severe letter. Titus is instructed to meet Paul at Troas. So Paul then sends the severe letter. He sends that to Corinth, and he tells Titus, I want you to meet me at Troas and let me know what happened. Number 12, according to the plan outlined in 1 Corinthians 16, 5-9, but after some delay, he leaves Ephesus for Macedonia. He comes to Troas and cannot find Titus, so he goes to Macedonia to meet him. So then Paul goes up to Troas. Titus isn't there. Paul spends some time there. He does some ministry, but Titus hasn't shown up. And I can imagine what Paul is thinking. You know, what happened in Corinth? Titus, I've got to know what happened. These are my spiritual children. I won them to the Lord. I love them, and they used to love me. Did my letter work? Was it successful? Well, Titus never shows up in Troas, so Paul then goes back to Macedonia, and there he meets up with Titus. Number 13, Paul meets Titus, who relates that the worst is over, the rebellion is quelled. And then number 14, Paul writes 2 Corinthians, which he sends from Macedonia by Titus, accompanied by 2 brothers. So then Paul sends 2 Corinthians, then down to Corinth by Titus. And then number 15, Paul himself reaches Corinth for the third and last time. He spends 3 months there fulfilling his promise of 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 12, and 13. So Paul himself then comes down from Macedonia to Corinth. Look at the map. Look at all of this activity that there is between Paul and Corinth. Letters, trips that he made, trips that his emissaries made for him. You can see there is a lot going on here between Paul and Corinth. And probably there is a lot going on with other cities as well that we don't have recorded in Acts. Now, I think I had better erase this.
Can I ask a quick question?
Sure, go ahead.
Is there a huge time period in between the writing of the First and Second Thessalonians? Like in that chart you were talking about, they are like spaced apart with some other epistles in between.
Thessalonians or Corinthians?
Thessalonians.
Okay, no, there's not a large space of time between them. Enough time for Silas and Timothy to return to Macedonia with First Thessalonians, and then return to Paul with their message about what's going on there. And then Paul writes 2 Thessalonians. So it could have been within the same year, if not, certainly within the next year. So there's not a long time space, probably months.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions, comments here? All right. Let me see if I can go on. Here we go. Okay, there are 3 specific sources for Paul's information. Chloe's household that told him about divisions in the church, the letter from the Corinthian church, and then Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Achaicus, who may have delivered the letter themselves. In terms of date, this is the estimates of date from various scholars, going anywhere from 53 to 57. 57 is pretty late. Probably it was written in 54 to 55, in that area. The place or provenance, it was written in Ephesus. Now, I have a used to have at least, a King James Bible that said it was written from Philippi, but that is not right. It was written from Ephesus, and that is really quite clear. The plan or outline. The outline of 1 Corinthians is very simple. At the beginning, there is an introduction. At the end, there is concluding matters. But in the middle, the body of the letter is divided into 2 parts. The first is in response to reports, 1:10 to 6:20. The second is in response to the Corinthians letter from 7:1 to 6:12. Witherington suggests another way of doing this, which is not many people do it this way. The foundation issue of wisdom in 1 to 4, issues of the church and the world, boundary issues 5 to 10, issues within the church 11 to 16. But basically, you have the two parts. Paul responds to reports, 1 to 6. Paul responds to the Corinthians letter, 7 to 16, with an introduction and conclusion on each end. Is there a key to understanding 1 Corinthians, a key that is going to explain everything? Here are some suggestions. Ferdinand Christian Bauer says Jewish versus Gentile viewpoints. That can pretty well be laid aside. Walter Schmidtall says Gnosticism. That probably can be laid aside too. Anthony Thistleton says over-realized eschatology is the key to everything. Gerd Tyson says it's class distinctions that's the basic issue. And Antoinette Weyer says it is women's issues. If there is one point that we could say is stressed more than any other throughout the epistle, it would be the importance of unity in the local church, since it is Christ's body. The relevance of 1 Corinthians today. And Anthony Thistleton says, with today's postmodern mood, we may compare the self-sufficient, self-congratulatory culture of Corinth, coupled with an obsession about peer group prestige, success in competition, their devaluing of tradition and universals, and near contempt for those with outstanding in some chosen value system. All this provides an embarrassingly close model of a postmodern context for the gospel in our own times, even given the huge historical differences in so many other respects, quite apart from its rich theology of grace, the cross, the Holy Spirit, the ministry, love, and the resurrection as an example of communicative action between the gospel and the world of a given time. 1 Corinthians stands in a distinctive position of relevance to our own time. Here we have the fact that 1 Corinthians is very relevant. Look at the issues there. The issues of sexual conduct, the issues of unity in the church, the issues of worship. How do we use the gifts in worship? All of these things are very relevant. And the key chapter in 1 Corinthians is chapter 13, the most famous of the chapters, the love chapter. Almost every problem that arises in the letter is answered in chapter 13. Of course, in chapter 15, we have the great resurrection chapter, giving Paul's view of the resurrection, his great teaching of the resurrection. And this is certainly a very, very rich letter. In fact, it's one of my favorite letters to teach at APTS. Okay, do you have questions or comments here on the introduction to the Corinthian letters and then specifically 1 Corinthians? All right. Let us go on then to 2 Corinthians. In terms of authorship, like 1 Corinthians, the Pauline authorship of 2 Corinthians is unquestioned. The internal evidence is undeniable and all that one could want. The external evidence is good, though not quite as good as that of 1 Corinthians. Unity. Now here we come to the major issue of 2 Corinthians. Several sections of the book do not seem like they fit together. Chapters 1 to 7 seem to present a peaceful reconciliation between Paul and the Corinthians, but chapters 10 to 13 depict renewed hostility. Chapters 8 and 9 seem to repeat the same message twice. 6:14 to 7:1 to some seem completely out of context and something that Paul would not write. The first source of dispute is 2:14 to 7:4. If you read 2:13 and then skip to 7:5, it reads smoothly and is dealing with the same subject matter. Now, when I went to Troas to preach the gospel of Christ and found that the Lord had opened a door for me, I still had no peace of mind because I did not find my brother Titus there. So I said goodbye to them and went on to Macedonia and skipped down to 7:5. For when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest, but we were harassed at every turn, conflicts on the outside, and fears on the inside. So some people say, since those fit together so well, they must have originally gone together. Well, probably not. There's no proof of that. Paul does this kind of thing. So we probably can't go along with that. There are many places in Paul's letters where this can be done. It reads smoothly as it stands, and there is no compelling reason to think it should be otherwise. There is also no textual evidence for such an interpolation. The next area of dispute is 6:14 to 7:1. In 6:11 to 13, Paul pleads with the Corinthians to respond to the affection that he has for them. Then rather abruptly, he exhorts them to be separate from the world. And then in 7:2, he picks up where he left off in 6:13. You can see we have spoken freely to you, Corinthians, and opened wide our hearts to you. We are not withholding our affection from you, but you are withholding yours from us. As a fair exchange, I speak as to my children, open wide your hearts also. Make room for us in your hearts. We have wronged no one, we have corrupted no one, we have exploited no one. That argument is like we looked at in the first argument there. It has problems. Paul often digresses in just this way, and the language of 7:2 could show that he realizes he has digressed and he is now taking up where he left off. The main problem with this theory is that there is no manuscript evidence that there ever was a 2 Corinthians without the insertion. Also, if one holds that 6:14 to 7:1 is part of the previous letter, he must be able to give a convincing explanation of what happened to the beginning and end of it. Those who say that 6:14 to 7:1's violent interruptions of the sequence of thought is evidence that there is an interpolation must also tell us why an editor would put it in such a place so as to be so obviously out of place. So that argument just doesn't work. Some say that chapter 8 is out of place since chapter 9 begins as if the collection was being introduced for the first time. But he doesn't cover the same territory again. He exhorts them to give generously. Very few people today hold that chapter 8 is an insertion. The major dispute about the unity of 2 Corinthians regards chapter 10 to 13. Many feel that the last 4 chapters are not part of the original letter, but are an addition, although all the scholars agree that these chapters are by Paul. The main reason for this theory is the drastic change of mood in 10:1. But the difference of tone shouldn't be exaggerated. Yes, there is a change, but it's not as drastic as some would have us believe. Everything in chapters 1 to 9 is not settled and peaceful. Not everything in chapters 10 to 13 is in harsh, radical terms. The section ends on a very loving and gentle note. The fact that in chapters 1 to 9, Paul looks back at his visit, and in chapters 10 to 13, he looks forward to his visit, constitutes the secondary argument for the lack of unity. But they are simply referring to different visits. In the beginning, he looks back at his recent visit, and in the latter part, he looks forward to his future visit. We should note some facts on this. There is no manuscript evidence for the hypothesized lack of unity. Not one manuscript, version, or lectionary lends itself to this interpretation. All evidence for this is internal. What happened at the end of the letter, ending at chapter 9, and the beginning of the letter beginning at chapter 10? What happened to the ending and the beginning if these are two letters that have just been put together? That must be explained. If there was a manipulation of the early manuscripts, the one who did it did a good enough job to fool the church for 18 centuries. The best supposition is that our letter forms an original unity, that 2 Corinthians is the way that Paul wrote it. The occasion, Paul received word from Titus that the rebellion was quelled in Corinth. Not all problems were solved, but the Corinthians as a whole affirmed their love for Paul. The date would be about a year after 1 Corinthians, that is AD 55 or 56. The place is Macedonia. And in terms of an outline, the book falls into three major sections: chapters 1 to 7, chapters 8 and 9, which deal with giving, and then chapters 10 to 13. Hughes takes Paul's coming visit as the background for the whole letter, with these three chapter divisions being various aspects of this. The change in itineraries explained in 1:7, the preparation for the visit in 8 and 9, and the certainty and imminence of the visit in 10 to 13. And this is Achtemeyer, Green, and Thompson's outline of 2 Corinthians. The letter opening, and then prayer and blessing, 3 to 7, chapter 1. Letter body, 1:8 to 13:10. And under this, we have defense against attacks on Paul's sincerity and authority as an apostle, relationships with unbelievers, and the collection for the Christians in Jerusalem. And then we have the defense of the legitimacy of Paul's apostolic calling, 10:1 to 13:10. And then the letter closing, final exhortation, greetings, and final blessing. So that will be our introduction then to 2 Corinthians. Okay, do you have questions or comments here? 2 Corinthians. While you're thinking, let me just say that 2 Corinthians is one of my favorite books, letters written by Paul. When I first became a senior pastor, I did a sermon series, Sunday mornings from 2 Corinthians, paragraph by paragraph. We started in September, we ended in May. And here in 2 Corinthians, we see the real Paul. He takes off his mask. He lets us see the real Paul, warts and all. He's very, very open and transparent. He tells how he went through a very difficult time in Asia, which would be Ephesus. So difficult that he thought he was going to die. But he says that happened to me so that I might depend upon him who raises the dead and not upon myself. Maybe I was depending on myself before, but this taught me that I had to depend upon the Lord. And that time that he had in Asia was so severe that some scholars believe that up to this point, Paul envisioned himself as being alive when Christ returned. But after that point, he saw that he may very well be dead by the time Christ returns. Throughout this book, Paul is so open and transparent. It's one of my favorites. Questions or comments on 2 Corinthians? None? All right, then let us go on. Okay, the book of Galatians. Galatians is an extremely important book in New Testament studies. It's also controversial today. Scholars debate about what the central concern of Galatians is. How is it that is his central concern how one is saved or who makes up the people of God? Those are the two major positions today. That Paul is concerned about how a person is saved, or is his major concern who makes up the people of God? Are works of the law things that are done to be saved, or are they barriers that separate Jew and Gentile? Now let's look at Galatians in terms of introduction. Authorship or authenticity. Galatians was written by the Apostle Paul. Today, there is virtually no one who would doubt that. The evidence that Paul wrote Galatians is so overwhelming that we won't even consider the possibility that he didn't write it. The rest of the items in Galatians depend upon who it was written to. So the recipients. Okay, let's go back to Romans. What was the major issue in Romans? Major issue of controversy? Was it authorship? Was that controversial in Romans? Okay, no, it wasn't. Romans is in that left column. Undisputed, written by Paul. In 1 Corinthians, I don't think there really are any major issues. Authorship is not, the recipients is not, the date, the place, unity, none of these are major items in 1 Corinthians. What about 2 Corinthians? What in 2 Corinthians is the major point of controversy?
Unity.
All right, exactly. Unity. Unity is the major point. Authorship is not. It's in the left column. You remember? But it is unity. Now we're coming to Galatians. Is authorship controversial in Galatians? Okay, no, it's not. There's nobody who doubts that Paul wrote Galatians. Again, left column. But the point of controversy here is the recipients. To whom was Galatians written? And there are two options. One we call North Galatia, one we call South Galatia. Galatia, the geographic territory, Galatia, the Roman province. In the 3rd century BC, Gauls from France, from Europe, what is now France, migrated to the central area of Asia Minor. It's a very interesting thing, you know, that a people movement would go from Gaul to Asia Minor, and that is where Galatia gets its name, from the Gauls that came from France. It's amazing how this happens, and this isn't the only time that this kind of thing has happened, but it happened there in the 3rd century. The territory where they settled became the Kingdom of Galatia. This is the geographic region of Galatia. In 64 BC, the Kingdom of Galatia became a province of Rome and was enlarged to include portions of Pontus, Phrygia, Lycaonia, Pamphylia, and Isauria. So here we have a comparison of the two. On the left, we have the Kingdom of Galatia. On the right, we have the Roman province of Galatia. Now notice how that the one is larger than the other. So the second one here, the Roman province, takes in cities that we know Paul went to. Antioch, Lystra, Iconium, Derbe. So when Paul says to the churches in Galatia, he could be referring to the cities of Ancyra, Pessinus, and Tavium in North Galatia, that's on the left side there, or to Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe in South Galatia. Which is it? Well, I believe that the preponderance of evidence points to South Galatia. Although we can't be entirely certain as to which it was, there is no direct evidence that Paul ever went to North Galatia. It's possible, but there is no record of it in Acts, nor any mention of it in Paul's epistles. So this is a major issue. Now, depending upon which you choose, it's going to determine the other factors. For example, the date. If you accept the South Galatian theory, then you can see the letter being written after Paul's first missionary journey, which took him to Lystra, Iconium, and Derbe. It took place in AD 47 to 48. F.F. Bruce dates it to AD 48. So probably around this time, 47, 48, 49, which means that it's probably Paul's earliest letter. If you take the North Galatian theory, you have to allow time for that to have taken place. The only places where it seems it could possibly have taken place are at Acts 16:6 on Paul's second missionary journey, or at Acts 18:23 on Paul's third missionary journey. In that case, it would have been written in the mid-50s. We also know nothing about Paul's ministry during that 10-year gap that we mentioned before. Could it have been then that he ministered then in North Galatia? In Galatians 1:21, Paul seems to say that he ministered only in Syria and Cilicia during that time. So the question of date is how you see Galatians fitting in to Acts. Acts records 5 visits of Paul to Jerusalem. And using Longenecker's terminology here, we have, first of all, the conversion visit, Acts 9:26 to 30. 2, the famine visit, Acts 11:27 to 30. 3, the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15. 4, the hasty visit, Acts 18:22. And then the collection visit, Acts 21:15 to 17. Galatians 1:18 and 19 is generally accepted as referring to the conversion visit of Acts 9:26 to 30. So specifically, the question that we must ask is Galatians 2 to be identified with Acts 11:27 to 30, or which is the famine visit, or Acts 15, the Jerusalem Council? Now, in this discussion, we are going to assume 2 things. Number 1, Acts is accurate. And number 2, Paul is telling the truth. Okay? We have to stop here. Let's take a break. It's time for a break, isn't it? No, it's time to quit, isn't it? That's right, it's time to quit. So we'll stop here and we will pick up here next time. You might just go ahead and look through the PowerPoint because we're going to move very quickly. And I would encourage you to do that if you get a chance. Before we stop, do you have any questions or comments? All right, we will stop. The Lord bless you, and we will see you on Friday.
Thank you.
No, I'm
Thank
sorry.
you.
I'm
Thank you,
sorry.
Doctor.
Thank you,
So
Dr.
we'll see you
Killen.
next time.
Next time.
Yes. God bless you.
Okay, Doctor.